Syllogistic rules and fallacies continued, so we are still in section 5.3. Okay, so we went over the first three. Let's go to rule 4 now. So remember, you have a syllogism, and you would take this one syllogism through these 5 rules. I'm giving you a different syllogism per rule just to point out how the rule can be violated. But normally what you'll do is you'll have one syllogism and just in order take it through each rule. So let's go to rule 4, and sometimes in logic textbooks they will break this into 2 sometimes, but they're conflating it into one rule, rule 4. A negative premise requires a negative conclusion, and a negative conclusion requires a negative premise. Okay, so this one here, let's see, we have a negative premise, so we need to have a negative conclusion, but we do not. So if you had a syllogism and you saw this going on, you would say invalid, because all you need to do is find just one rule that's broken, but you can find more than one. You can, in the answers in the back of the book for some of the starred problems in this section, some of the exercises, you'll see 2 rules mentioned that were violated. So you would say invalid and the fallacy of drawing an affirmative conclusion from a negative premise. Okay, this one here, all right, we see that we have a negative conclusion. All right, if you have a negative conclusion, this requires a negative premise. You go up, and there's an affirmative premise, and also there's the minor premise is affirmative. So this is invalid, and if someone asked you why, you'll say, well, it's committing the fallacy of drawing a negative conclusion from affirmative premises. Okay? All right, so that's rule 4. Now I want to say something here. When we get to rule 5, this is the existential fallacy. You can only write down the existential fallacy. It only comes into play if the other 4 rules have not been violated. So let me write this down, and I'm going to repeat it. So, only if the first 4 rules have not been violated, will a syllogism have a possibility? It doesn't mean it will commit the existential fallacy, but you can only use this one. A syllogism is only said to commit this one if it's the only rule it violates, rule 5, but it doesn't violate the first 4. So only if the first 4 rules have not been violated will a syllogism have a possibility of committing the existential fallacy. Okay, and I'll explain that. Okay, first, what is the existential fallacy? If both premises are universal, the conclusion cannot be particular. Okay, so here we have 2 universal premises, and then we have a particular conclusion. So you remember from the Boolean for sure, this is going to be invalid, because you remember what I told you. We've talked about this a lot, but here's some review here. For the modern, you remember, if you have a universal such as, all S or P, all S R P, if you're a Martian and all you know is every single S is going to overlap with P, you could be a Martian and go, I don't even know what S and P are, I don't know if they exist, but logic just tells me here that if every S is a P, all of them, we're not going to have any S that's not a P. So all I know is this is empty. But I don't even know if something exists, so I don't know if I can even say at least one S is a P, right? Do you remember that? Is that bringing that back? So remember, if the first four rules are not violated, then you say, okay, so far so good, but because everything is fine with the first four, there is the possibility the existential fallacy can be committed. And I'll explain why, it only works if it's the only rule. Really what I'm saying here is only if Rule 5 is violated can you have an existential fallacy. That's what I'm trying to say here. I'll explain that a little bit more in a minute here. But for the modern, the Boolean standpoint, it's because they think with a universal, like for example the A, it says nothing about existence. You don't know if S exists or not. Okay? So that's why this for them, if 1 through 4 everything's fine, they'll say everything is fine. There's no key logical breaks going on in logic, but because there is no existential import, the conclusion can't be inferred from those premises. It's kind of like the reasoning is Rule 5 is more about there's no big major logical disconnect like in Rule 1 through 4. It's kind of a different fallacy, okay? And the reason is from universal statements, like this is an A proposition, it's universal. The modern people say all you know is there's no S that's not a P. You don't know if there's S at all, so you can't even know that there's at least one S. Okay? So let me read what I have down here, and this is going to repeat, and then we're going to talk a little bit about if you have both premises are universal, it may not be committing the existential fallacy according to Aristotle, right? Remember that? So let me see if I can really bring this down here, and I'm going to extend the page. Let's come back up here. Okay. So here we have Rule 5. Now, I'll tell you what. Let me go ahead and read what I have written down here. It's going to kind of repeat what I said, but that's good. Okay, more on the existential fallacy. A syllogism commits this fallacy when only this rule is violated, okay? If a syllogism breaks any of the first four rules, meaning it's invalid for some other reason other than violating Rule 5, then it does not commit the existential fallacy and refer to the other rule violations as your reason for invalidity, okay? So you really know what this essentially says is that if you're doing the syllogism and you go through Rule 1, you're testing it out. Rule 2, Rule 3, Rule 4. If it breaks any of these, let's say it broke Rule 1, then just say to yourself, it's not going to commit the existential fallacy. Okay? As soon as you break one of these, at least one of them, just say to yourself, Rule 5, not in play. Okay? You would never... you won't write it down, okay? So as soon as it violates 1 to 4, you're not going to write down existential fallacy. And the reason is, here's what the logicians mean. If you say it commits the existential fallacy, define it this way. You may want to write this down in your textbook. Here's what the existential fallacy means if you just think about this. It means, for the syllogism in question, that it does not have breaks in the logical chain of reasoning by violating any of the first four rules. You remember, the first four rules will tell you if a rule's violated, there's a break in the logical chain. So the existential fallacy means, for the syllogism in question, it doesn't have any of these key serious breaks in the logical chain of reasoning, which would be revealed by violating any of the first four rules, but rather there is just. Just doesn't mean it's insignificant. It just means the existential fallacy means no key major serious breaks in chain of reasoning. The existential fallacy says all that seems good, but rather there is just the absence of existential import which prevents the conclusion from being derived from the premises. So when the book talks about existential fallacy, I've annotated this fallacy. It does mean, if it's really happening, that you have two universal premises, and because there's no existential import, you can't get the conclusion. But it also means this. If we were going to kind of elaborate and expand on what I just said, existential fallacy means, for the syllogism in question, I'm going to repeat this, that it does not have breaks in the logical chain of reasoning by violating any of the first 4 rules, but rather this fallacy means that just the absence of existential import is, that condition, that absence is real, and this prevents the conclusion from being derived from the premises. Okay? So with the modern, you go through 1, 2, 3, 4, it's not violating any of them. Then you say to yourself, well, since it didn't violate any, I could still see it to violate existential fallacy, and that fallacy is basically saying first 4 rules are fine. It's a fallacy that highlights the only thing that's preventing the conclusion from being inferred is there's an issue of existential import. It's absent. Now you've got to remember, let's go over here to the 4 figures here. Aristotle says, you modern people, existential import, you don't think that it's there, and so you won't accept these things. Because you see, AAI, these are universal going to a particular. Aristotle, on the other hand, says, just because you have universal premises and a particular conclusion, he says, I don't think this is committing the existential fallacy as long as the key important term is referring to something that really exists. You got to remember, with Aristotle, he disagrees with the modern people. If you have a universal, and I know my circles are terrible, there's an A. If you have a universal proposition, and all S are P, he says, let's say you're talking about horses, and you're saying all horses are, 4, legged animals, right? Aristotle's going to disagree with them. If we say all horses are 4-legged animals, this means we're never ever going to find horses that are not 4-legged animals. He says horses exist. We can put an X in there. He says this isn't a question mark. So he says, if you tell me all horses are 4-legged animals, guess what? I know at least one horse is a 4-legged animal too. So he's going to go down, remember, and say some HRF is true. So he's going to say with the Venn diagram that there is an X there, and that's the Venn diagram for the I proposition, right? This is the I, and this is a true statement here. So because Aristotle says, look, if I see universal premises, I don't get all bent out of shape by you people. You modern people, I think you can infer a particular. So here's what you do. If the first four rules are not violated, then there is the possibility for the existential fallacy, because remember, that fallacy means first 4 are fine. I'm not saying with this fallacy there's any key logical break in logic. I'm saying there's a question of existential import. I think it's absent. You can't infer the conclusion. For the modern, if the first 4 aren't violated and you see this, it's not complicated, it's invalid. Okay? But for the Aristotelian standpoint, you have to go, however. If only this rule is violated, it still has to be the only one violated with Aristotle, then the existential fallacy, like I said, is committed from the Boolean or modern standpoint. But, let me just change the pen color here. But it may still be valid from the, here, I got to erase that. That was a terrible thing, outlining. Okay, let me try again. Okay, but it may still be valid from the Aristotelian standpoint and not commit this fallacy on a certain condition, that there is existential import. So, when you come here, if the first 4 rules haven't been violated, then you go, okay, then it could be the existential fallacy. Remember, if one of the 4, at least one of the 4 is violated, don't even think about writing this down, because this is saying all 4 are good, but there's an issue of existential import which prevents the conclusion from being inferred. If you see this and the first 4 haven't been violated, okay, I'm getting really redundant. The modern Boolean standpoint will say invalid existential fallacy. However, if this is the only rule violated, none of that changes. Aristotle says not so fast. There may be a chance on a certain condition that this syllogism doesn't commit the existential fallacy in my mind, and it is valid. And here's the condition. The critical term denotes at least one existing thing. If the key term is about something that exists, like horses, okay? Then it is valid from the Aristotelian standpoint and does not commit the existential fallacy. If you tell me all horses are 4-legged animals, I know horses exist, then logic tells me at least one horse on earth is a 4-legged animal, right? So if the key term is about something that exists in the real world, it's valid. It does not commit the existential fallacy. However, Aristotle will say if the key term in the premises does not have existential import, like it's talking about trolls, then he's going to agree with the Boolean, it is invalid, and he's also going to agree and say go ahead and write down the existential fallacy, because this means the first 4 rules were fine, but there was an absence of existential import, and that's why I even agree, if it's talking about trolls or flying reindeer, that conclusion could not be inferred. Now, I said something here interesting. The critical term, here's how you find out about the critical term. Go back to this list, okay, and let's go down here. And Aristotle says if you have a mood and figure down here, or you're looking at a syllogism, and you have 2 universal premises and a particular conclusion, he says determine the mood and figure of the syllogism. So you're going to have to do the A, E, I, and find out what figure. But he says once you look at the syllogism, you see universal, particular, he says find what mood and figure it is, find where it is on my conditionally valid list, and then see if the required condition is met. And here, if you see figure 1 with these moods, you have these moods in figure 2, figure 4 it's got that mood, on and on. Find out where it is and go over here to this last column. And this is saying the minor term, S here means minor term, M means middle term, and P means major term. So find out where the minor term is, and if it's talking about horses and not trolls, the minor term exists, it's valid, and when you go back, it will not commit the existential fallacy. If the middle term exists, then it doesn't violate Rule 5 according to Aristotle, and it doesn't commit the existential fallacy, and you say it's valid from the Aristotelian standpoint. And if it's got this form and the major term is about horses or cats and not trolls or flying reindeer, Aristotle will say valid, does not commit the existential fallacy. Okay, so we'll end there. The next thing we have is Venn diagrams for syllogisms. These are the 3-ring Venn diagrams. And don't worry about those. When I explain them, you will understand them perfectly. They're really not that hard, and that'll be our 3rd test. So you have a syllogism, mood and figure, and the 2 lists here, right up here, are going to tell you if it appears on any of these 2 lists, it's valid. This list is Aristotle's list, so there's certain conditions. These people won't like it, but these people will. Aristotle will, or Aristotelians. Then you have rules. And I've gone over the syllogistic rules and fallacies, so I've given you 2 methods. The 3rd one is Venn diagrams for syllogisms. And remember, if something's valid, it should pass all three of these methods. It should be valid by the mood and figure method, it shouldn't violate any rules, and the Venn diagram we should be able to show by looking at those graphs, those diagrams, that the syllogism is valid as well.